In the rural Pennsylvania autumn of 1871, a simple property dispute revealed one of American history's most disturbing medical conspiracies. County officials arriving at the settlement called Harmonia Springs to serve eviction notices discovered 23 abandoned houses, a medical facility with files documenting 15 years of systematic human experimentation, and graves. So many graves, holding children whose skeletal deformities were unlike anything local physicians had ever witnessed. Among the scattered papers was the Journal of Sarah Brennan, whose final entry contained 5 words that would haunt investigators for decades: "We were brother and sister." What occurred in Harmonia Springs from 1856 to 1871 was so methodically evil that 3 separate congressional inquiries attempted to bury the evidence, claiming the knowledge itself threatened public morality. Before we continue with the story of Harmonia Springs, if America's darkest historical secrets fascinate you, subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. You might be closer to these events than you imagine. The settlement that would become known as Harmonia Springs began not with horror, but with hope. The kind of desperate hope that makes people believe impossible promises. The year was 1856, and Pennsylvania was experiencing one of its most tumultuous periods. The Industrial Revolution had left thousands of workers displaced, injured, and destitute. Weekly coal mining accidents were claiming lives in the anthracite fields of Schuylkill County, and the medical establishment, still decades from understanding basic hygiene, could offer little help to the broken bodies emerging from the mines. In Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, factory workers lost fingers to machinery, developed respiratory diseases from cotton dust, and died young from exhaustion. Into this landscape of desperation arrived Dr. Cornelius Engelhard, bearing what seemed like a miracle. Dr. Engelhard wasn't like other Lancaster County physicians. While they practiced bloodletting and prescribed mercury for everything from headaches to hysteria, Engelhard spoke of revolutionary treatments from the great medical schools of Vienna and Berlin. He was 43 years old, stood 6 feet tall with prematurely white hair that gave him an air of distinction, and possessed a speaking manner that made even the most skeptical farmers lean forward to listen. His credentials were impressive: graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, class of 1835, trained under famous European physiologists, including a year with Rudolf Virchow in Berlin, published in journals nobody in rural Pennsylvania had heard of, but which sounded tremendously important. He first appeared in Lancaster in the spring of 1856, staying at the White Swan Inn on King Street. Local doctors remembered him attending their medical society meetings, where he would listen politely to their discussions of humoral theory before standing to deliver passionate speeches about the new science of heredity. He spoke of Gregor Mendel's work with pea plants, though Mendel's papers wouldn't be widely known for another decade. He described theories of bloodline purification that he claimed were being tested in Europe's finest sanitariums. Most compelling of all, he had enough money to purchase 800 acres of prime farmland without negotiating the price. The land he chose was along Conewago Creek, about 15 miles northwest of Lancaster proper. It had belonged to the Hare family for 3 generations, but crop failures and debt had forced them to sell. The location was perfect for Engelhard's purposes, isolated enough to avoid the prying eyes of conventional medical authorities, yet accessible by the newly constructed railroad line connecting Lancaster to Harrisburg. The property included a natural spring bubbling up from limestone bedrock, its water carrying a slight sulfur smell that Engelhard claimed held therapeutic properties. Within months, construction began. Engelhard hired German and Irish workers from Lancaster, paying them well above typical wages but requiring them to sign contracts promising silence about what they were building. The main medical facility was a 3-story brick building with a distinctive cupola, larger than most hospitals of the era. Surrounding it, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern that Engelhard insisted was essential for harmonic living, were sites for 36 identical houses, 2 stories, for rooms downstairs, for rooms upstairs, with modern conveniences like indoor water pumps and advanced ventilation systems. The first families arrived in March of 1857, still wearing winter coats against the late cold snap that had frozen the creek solid. They were carefully selected. Engelhard had placed advertisements in German-language newspapers throughout Pennsylvania, seeking families of good moral character afflicted by hereditary ailments. Revolutionary medical treatment offered at no cost. Room, board, and employment provided. children especially welcome for preventive care. The responses were overwhelming. Desperate letters poured in from across the state, parents describing children with club foot, hair lip, seizures, mental deficiencies, and countless other ailments that 19th-century medicine couldn't cure. Engelhard personally reviewed each application, though his selection criteria seemed mysterious. He rejected a wealthy merchant family from Philadelphia while accepting the destitute Zimmermans from Berks County. He turned away a war veteran with a missing arm but welcomed the Grabbers, whose daughter Anna suffered from periodic seizures leaving her unconscious for hours. The Zimmerman family, Johannes, his wife Catherine, and their 4 children, arrived first. Their youngest son, Peter, had been born with severe rickets that left his legs grotesquely bowed. Johannes had spent everything on treatments that didn't work: cod liver oil, special braces forged by a blacksmith, even painful surgery in Philadelphia that only made things worse. When Engelhard examined Peter, running his hands along the boy's twisted bones with a gentleness that made Catherine weep, he proclaimed the child's condition entirely curable through proper nutrition and his revolutionary bone-stretching apparatus. The Grabbers came next, their wagon loaded with the few possessions they hadn't sold to pay for Anna's treatments. She was 16, pretty despite the exhaustion lining her face, and had suffered seizures since age 12. The local minister in Lebanon had suggested the fits were divine punishment for some hidden sin, which had driven her father, Jacob, to near violence. Engelhard dismissed such superstition with a wave. Anna's condition, he explained, was merely an electrical imbalance in the brain correctable through carefully calibrated galvanic treatments. By summer, 15 families had taken residence in Harmonia Springs, the Hersbergers from York County, whose 3 children all showed signs of what Engelhard called hereditary mental weakness, the Yoders from Chester County, fleeing the shame of a daughter born with a cleft palate so severe that townspeople crossed themselves when they saw her, the Stoltzes, the Weavers, the Pennypackers, the Grabbers. Each family brought their own burden of suffering and their desperate hope that this strange doctor with his revolutionary theories could provide salvation. What made Engelhard's offer irresistible wasn't just the promise of revolutionary medical treatment. He offered something even more precious in those uncertain times: dignity. In Harmonia Springs, their children wouldn't be stared at or whispered about. They wouldn't be called cursed or demon-touched. They would be patients, subjects of scientific study, pioneers in the advancement of medical knowledge. The parents, many reduced to begging or charity, were given meaningful work. The men labored in the settlement's workshops and fields. The women tended gardens and helped with medical care. Everyone received a small wage plus housing and food. The early months seemed to validate every promise. The mineral-rich spring water did seem to help certain ailments. Children who had arrived pale and listless began showing color in their cheeks. Peter Zimmerman's legs, subjected daily to Engelhard's stretching machine and special exercises, began to straighten slightly. Anna Grabber's seizures became less frequent after her galvanic treatments. The Yoder girl's cleft palate was surgically repaired by Engelhard himself in a procedure remarkably advanced for 1857. But there were strict rules in Harmonia Springs, rules Engelhard insisted were essential to the treatment process. Families were discouraged from leaving except for essential business, and even then, they needed Engelhard's written permission. Mail was collected and distributed through Engelhard's office, supposedly to prevent the stress of bad news from interfering with recovery. Visitors were strictly prohibited unless approved in advance, ostensibly to prevent disease introduction. Most significantly, Engelhard instituted what he called the program of hereditary optimization. Every Tuesday evening, the entire community gathered in the meeting hall for Engelhard's lectures. He would stand at the podium, charts and diagrams behind him, explaining his theories with the passion of a revivalist preacher. Most human ailments, he proclaimed, were caused by what he termed bloodline contamination, the mixing of incompatible hereditary essences through generations of unscientific breeding. The first wedding in Harmonia Springs took place on September 15, 1858, over a year after the settlement's founding. The delay had been intentional. Engelhard insisted he needed time to complete his hereditary analyses, to map out the optimal pairings that would produce healthy offspring. The chosen couple was Sarah Grabber, now 18, and William Brennan, 21. Their match, Engelhard proclaimed to the gathered community, represented the perfect confluence of complementary hereditary factors. Sarah had flourished in Harmonia Springs. Her seizures, which had plagued her for years, stopped completely after 6 months of treatment. She had gained weight, her cheeks were rosy, and she moved with a grace impossible when fits could strike at any moment. She worked in the settlement school, helping Charlotte Pennypacker teach the younger children their letters and numbers. In the evenings, she would sit with her parents on their porch, her mother Elizabeth braiding her long auburn hair while her father Jacob read from the Bible in his steady, comforting voice. William Brennan's transformation had been equally remarkable. He had arrived in the summer of 1857, brought by a distant relative who had heard of Engelhard's work. William's story was tragic. Orphaned at 7 when his parents died in what he'd been told was a cholera outbreak in Philadelphia, raised by an aunt in Chester County who could barely afford to feed him, suffering chronic respiratory ailments that left him gasping for breath, unable to work more than a few hours without collapsing. Under Engelhard's care, with daily vapor inhalation and chest percussion treatments, he had become strong enough to work full days in the settlement's carpentry shop. The courtship had been carefully orchestrated by Engelhard. He assigned Sarah and William to work together on settlement projects, cataloging the medical library, maintaining the herb garden, teaching Sunday school to the youngest children. He noted in his private journal how they began to seek each other's company, how William would save the best lumber pieces to make small gifts for Sarah, how she would bring him special treats from her mother's kitchen. When Engelhard announced their engagement at a Tuesday lecture, he presented it as a triumph of scientific matching. He showed charts indicating their complementary physical characteristics, graphs demonstrating the likelihood of healthy offspring, even phrenological measurements suggesting perfect temperamental compatibility. The other families, desperate to believe in Engelhard's vision, celebrated the match. Here was proof their children could have normal lives, could marry and prosper despite their ailments. The wedding day dawned clear and cool, unusual for September in Pennsylvania. The settlement women had been preparing for weeks. Frieda Zimmerman had sewn Sarah's dress from white cotton that Engelhard had specially ordered from Philadelphia, incorporating tiny seed pearls that caught the light when she moved. The Herzberger women had baked enough pastries to feed twice their number, using precious sugar and flour representing a significant portion of the settlement's resources. Even the children, many bearing visible signs of various ailments, had been dressed in their finest clothes and instructed in proper wedding behavior. The ceremony took place in the meeting hall, transformed with garlands of late summer flowers, goldenrod, asters, and chrysanthemums from the settlement's gardens. Engelhard himself performed the ceremony. He had obtained ministerial credentials through the obscure Church of Human Perfectibility, a denomination none of the German Lutheran or Reformed families had heard of. But his words about marriage's sacred nature and the blessing of children moved many to tears. Charlotte Pennypacker played the small organ donated by a Lancaster benefactor, filling the hall with hymns echoing off the wooden rafters. Sarah entered on her father's arm, radiant in her white dress, her hair crowned with a wreath of white roses from her mother's garden. William stood at the altar in a new black suit the settlement tailor had made specially, his hands trembling slightly as he watched his bride approach. The vows they exchanged were traditional, with one addition Engelhard had insisted upon. After promising to love, honor, and cherish, both Sarah and William pledged to honor the sacred principles of hereditary science and raise their children according to the laws of natural optimization. At the time, it seemed merely another of Engelhard's eccentricities, no more unusual than his insistence on daily mineral baths or his prohibition of certain foods he deemed hereditarily contaminated. That evening, as the celebration continued in the meeting hall with dancing and feasting, Engelhard retired to his office to make a special entry in his private journal, *, the primary phase of experiment series 3 has been successfully initiated. Subjects 3A, SG, and 3B, WB, have been joined in matrimony without suspicion of their true relationship. Both subjects remain entirely unaware they share the same parentage, specifically, that they are fraternal twins separated at 13 months of age. Their physical differences, developed through disparate upbringing conditions, have prevented recognition of their familial resemblance. The next phase, reproduction, will provide crucial data on the effects of pure bloodline concentration. I anticipate the first offspring within 12 to 18 months. *. The newlyweds were given a house on the settlement's eastern edge, a modest two-story structure with a creek view. William had spent weeks preparing it, crafting furniture with his own hands, including a beautiful cradle placed optimistically in the upstairs bedroom. Sarah arranged their few possessions with care, hanging curtains her mother had sewn, placing her Bible on the bedside table, setting William's tools in neat rows in his workshop. They were young, in love, and believed they were beginning a blessed life together. The first signs of trouble came quickly. Sarah became pregnant within 2 months of the wedding, which Engelhard proclaimed as evidence of their excellent hereditary compatibility. But the pregnancy was difficult from the start. She suffered constant nausea no remedy could cure, debilitating headaches leaving her bedridden for days, and strange episodes where she would stare at nothing for hours, unresponsive to William's increasingly frantic attempts to rouse her. Thomas Brennan was born on June 21, 1859, as the summer solstice bathed Harmonia Springs in the year's longest light. But there was no light in the birthing room where Sarah labored for 36 hours, her screams echoing across the settlement. Charlotte Pennypacker, serving as midwife, knew something was wrong the moment the baby crowned. The head was too large, grotesquely so, and misshapen in a way that made her hands tremble as she guided the infant into the world. The child that emerged was a study in abnormality. His skull was elongated, almost cone-shaped, with a visible ridge along the top. His eyes, one brown like Sarah's, one grey-green like William's, seemed to track movement independently, giving him an unsettling, unfocused gaze. Most disturbing were his hands, fingers fused at birth, creating paddle-like appendages that Charlotte had to carefully separate with a scalpel while the baby screamed. Engelhard's reaction to Thomas's birth was not the concern expected from a physician. Instead, he showed excitement, almost glee, in measuring the infant's skull with calipers, documenting every abnormality in detailed notes, taking measurements he recorded in charts only he understood. He assured the distraught parents these were merely variations in hereditary expression that would normalize with proper treatment. He prescribed a regimen of skull massage, electrical stimulation, and special feeding formulas he prepared himself in his laboratory. Other births in Harmonia Springs during 1859 and 1860 showed similar abnormality patterns. The Zimmerman twins, Eva and Emma, born in January 1860, had matching spinal deformities causing constant pain. Their cries, a horrible keening that never seemed to stop, could be heard throughout the settlement at night. The Yoda's son, born that spring, had a cleft palate so severe he couldn't nurse properly and had to be fed through a tube Engelhard inserted directly into his stomach. The Herzberger baby girl had limbs bending at impossible angles, her joints seeming to work in reverse. But it was the pattern of deaths that began to reveal the true horror. Of the 12 children born in Harmonia Springs between 1859 and 1861, 7 died before their first birthday. Causes listed on death certificates were vague: hereditary insufficiency, constitutional weakness, failure to thrive. The small cemetery on the hillside above the settlement began filling with tiny headstones, most bearing dates spanning only weeks or months. Parents gathered at these graves in evening twilight when Engelhard's assistants were less likely to observe them. They would whisper their fears, wondering if the treatments were somehow causing these problems rather than curing them. But Engelhard always had explanations. The children's conditions were caused by generations of hereditary contamination that couldn't be corrected in a single generation. It would take time, patience, and continued breeding to achieve the perfection he sought. Sarah's second pregnancy, beginning in late 1860, was even worse than the first. She suffered hallucinations, claiming to see children who weren't there, hearing voices calling her name from empty rooms. William would find her standing at the window at night, staring at nothing, tears streaming down her face. When he asked what was wrong, she would say she didn't know, that she felt as if something fundamental was broken inside her, as if her body was rejecting itself. Margaret Brennan was born on March 15, 1861, as the nation descended into civil war. She lived only 3 months, her body simply unable to sustain life despite Engelhard's increasingly desperate interventions. The child's deformities were so severe that Charlotte Pennypacker, hardened by years of witnessing medical horrors, wept as she wrapped the tiny body for burial. The official cause was listed as hereditary insufficiency, but Charlotte noted privately that the child's internal organs seemed arranged incorrectly, as if nature itself had become confused in forming her. The Civil War, raging beyond their isolated valley, provided Engelhard with unexpected opportunities. He began receiving shipments of orphans from battlefield areas, children whose parents had supposedly been killed in the fighting. These children, he explained to the settlement, would be raised in their wholesome environment and eventually integrated into the hereditary optimization program. What the residents didn't know was that many weren't orphans at all, but had been purchased or taken from desperate families, selected for specific physical characteristics Engelhard believed would enhance his breeding program. Among these supposed orphans were two children arriving in the summer of 1865, Daniel, aged 7, and Rebecca, aged 5. They came separately, Daniel in June, Rebecca in August, both supposedly from families killed in the fighting around Gettysburg. Daniel was placed with the Stoltzes, who had recently lost their own son to one of the mysterious fevers periodically sweeping through the settlement's children. Rebecca went to live with the Weavers on the settlement's opposite side. Engelhard insisted the children be kept apart, claiming survivors of such trauma needed to form new attachments rather than dwelling on shared memories of loss. But Charlotte Pennepacker noticed something odd in Engelhard's records. Both children were listed with the same coded designation, *specimen group 7, paired star. When she questioned this, Engelhard became furious, accusing her of overstepping and threatening dismissal. Charlotte had been with Engelhard since the beginning, recruited from Philadelphia where she had trained as a nurse at Pennsylvania Hospital. She was 35, unmarried, and had devoted her life to medicine when few women were permitted such careers. Initially, she had been impressed by Engelhard's theories, his talk of using science to eliminate human suffering. But as years passed and she witnessed the mounting horror of malformed children and grieving parents, her faith in his mission crumbled. Late at night, when Engelhard was occupied with experiments in the medical facility's basement laboratory, Charlotte began her own investigation. She copied his records, creating a secret archive hidden beneath loose floorboards in her quarters. She traced the orphans' origins, finding purchase orders from poorhouses, bills of sale referring to children as specimens, correspondence with other doctors conducting similar experiments in other states. The spring of 1868 brought two events that would begin to unravel Engelhard's carefully constructed deception. The first was an outbreak of what Engelhard called hereditary fever, but was almost certainly a combination of measles and scarlet fever arriving with a new family from Harrisburg. In a normal community, such diseases would have been serious but manageable. In Harmonia Springs, where years of inbreeding had produced children with virtually no immune resistance, it was catastrophic. The fever struck the children first. Little Eva Zimmerman was the first to fall ill, her already fragile body racked with fever and covered in a rash like burns. Within days, her twin Emma showed the same symptoms. Then the Yoder children, the Herzberger baby, Thomas Brennan, one by one, the children of Harmonia Springs fell ill. Engelhard's response was to quarantine the sick children in the medical facility, claiming he needed to prevent contamination spread. Parents were forbidden from visiting, told emotional distress would interfere with treatment. But Charlotte, tasked with caring for the children, saw the truth. Engelhard was using the outbreak as an opportunity for more experiments, testing various compounds on the dying children, documenting their suffering with clinical detachment. 17 children died in 3 weeks. The youngest was barely 6 months old, the eldest just 8. The bodies were wrapped in white sheets and buried in a mass grave that Engelhard insisted was necessary to prevent disease spread. Parents who had already buried multiple children now weren't even allowed to say goodbye to their dead. The grief descending on Harmonia Springs was like a physical weight pressing down on every household. It was Jacob Zimmerman who finally snapped. He had lost all 4 of his children to the fever, including the twins whose birth had been so difficult and whose short lives had been nothing but suffering. On the night of May 15, 1868, he broke into Engelhard's office through a window, determined to find answers. He had always been a methodical man. Before coming to Harmonia Springs, he had worked as a bookkeeper for a Lancaster merchant, and those skills served him now as he systematically searched Engelhard's files. The first ledger he opened seemed ordinary enough: medical records, treatment notes, observations about patient progress. But as he read deeper, the clinical language began revealing its true meaning. Subject breeding pairs were listed with code numbers rather than names. Hereditary confluence achieved appeared next to dates corresponding with settlements' weddings. Most chilling were entries about redundant specimens, children who had died or been born with deformities too severe to survive. Then Jacob found the master chart, a massive genealogical diagram covering an entire wall when unfolded. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard family tree of the settlement's residents. But as his eyes traced the connecting lines, he realized with growing horror that the same names appeared in multiple places, connected by different colored lines indicating different relationships. Sarah Grabber and William Brennan were connected not just as husband and wife, marked in blue, but by another line, marked in red, leading back to a common origin point labeled only as * specimen group 3, twin separation experiment star. His hand shaking, Jacob pulled more documents from a locked drawer he had pried open, adoption records from poorhouses across Pennsylvania, but with notes in Engelhardt's hand, * male child approximately 18 months. Strong Saxon features suitable for group 3 breeding. * purchase orders for children, actual purchase orders with prices listed as if they were livestock. And then the most damning evidence of all, original birth certificates hidden behind false ones, showing that children placed in different families, who had grown up believing they were orphans from different towns, were actually siblings. Sarah Grabber and William Brennan, according to a Philadelphia birth certificate dated March 3, 1840, were twins born to a woman named Mary Elizabeth Brennan. They had been separated at 13 months and sold to different families paid to maintain the fiction of their origins. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Jacob freeze. He quickly folded the most important documents, stuffed them inside his coat, and slipped out through the window. But Engelhard had already noticed the disturbance, a lamp left burning, papers slightly out of place. The next morning, he announced Jacob Zimmerman had suffered a grief-induced breakdown and had been taken to the state asylum in Harrisburg for treatment. Catherine Zimmerman, already destroyed by the loss of her children, was told her husband had attacked Engelhard in his madness and that commitment was the only alternative to criminal charges. No one in the settlement ever saw Jacob again. Months later, Catherine would receive a letter supposedly from the asylum stating her husband had died of brain fever. The letter was in Engelhardt's handwriting, though she was too broken to notice or care. Charlotte Pennypacker had watched Jacob enter the office from her window, had seen him flee with papers stuffed in his coat. She knew her time was running out. That night, she gathered her own collection of copied documents and prepared to act. But first, she had one more task: she had to warn Sarah Brennan. Charlotte arrived at Sarah's house just after sunset on May 20, 1868. Sarah was alone. William had been spending nights in the workshop, unable to bear being in the house where 2 of their children had died. Thomas, now 9, was asleep upstairs, his labored breathing audible even from the parlor. Sarah was 6 months pregnant with her 4th child, her body swollen and exhausted, her face bearing the hollow look of someone who had endured too much grief. "I need to tell you something," Charlotte whispered, glancing nervously at the windows. "About your husband. About both of you. About what Dr. Engelhard has done." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse to listen. She had survived by not asking questions, by accepting Engelhardt's explanations, by believing her children's deformities were God's will or nature's cruelty rather than something more sinister. But Charlotte's urgency, the document she pulled from her bag, the tears streaming down the older woman's face, all broke through Sarah's defenses. Charlotte showed her the birth certificate first, * Mary Elizabeth Brennan, mother. Twin births, 1 male, 1 female. March 3, 1840. Philadelphia General Hospital. * Then the adoption records, 2 different families, 2 different stories, but the same placement date, the same signature on both documents, Dr. Cornelius Engelhard. "You and William are twins," Charlotte said, gripping Sarah's hands as the younger woman began to shake. "Engelhard separated you as babies, placed you with different families, then brought you back together to marry. Your children's deformities, it's because you share the same blood. You're not just husband and wife. You're brother and sister." Sarah's reaction was not the hysteria Charlotte expected. Instead, she became very still, her hands moving to her swollen belly where another child, another product of this abomination, was growing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I think I always knew something was wrong. The way Thomas looks, he has William's eyes exactly, not just similar, exactly the same. And Margaret, before she died, her hands were identical to mine, down to the birthmark on the smallest finger. Even the way William laughs, it's the same sound I make. I thought it was because we were meant to be together, that God had made us perfectly matched. But it wasn't God, was it?" Over the following weeks, the truth spread through Harmonia Springs like a contagion. Charlotte had shared her documents with Sarah, who told Mary Yoder when she came to help with housework. Mary told her sister-in-law, who told the Weaver women during washing day. Each revelation brought new horrors. The Stoltzes discovered their 3 adopted children were all siblings. The Herzbergers learned the cousin they had taken in was actually their own son, taken at birth and returned years later as an orphan. William discovered the truth when he found Sarah burning their marriage certificate in the kitchen stove. She told him everything, showed him Charlotte's documents, watched as color drained from his face. He ran outside and vomited in the garden, then collapsed to his knees, sobbing. When he finally returned to the house, he couldn't look at her. He couldn't look at Thomas. He moved into the workshop permanently, leaving Sarah alone with their son and her pregnancy. Daniel and Rebecca, the young orphans who had arrived in 1865, had grown into teenagers by 1870. Now 15 and 13, they had begun noticing each other despite Ingelhard's efforts to keep them apart. They would meet secretly in the old barn where winter supplies were stored, drawn together by something neither could explain. As they talked, sharing fragmented memories of early childhood, the truth became undeniable. They both remembered a house with blue shutters, a woman singing German lullabies, the smell of bread baking on Sunday mornings. They were brother and sister, and Engelhard had been preparing them for the same fate as the Brennans. The settlement began to fracture. Some families attempted to flee, only to be brought back by Engelhard's assistants, rough men from Philadelphia with no medical training but plenty of violence experience. The Yoders made it to Lancaster before being caught and returned. Abraham Yoder's blackened eye and his wife's split lip sent a clear message to anyone else considering escape. Others turned to more desperate measures. Mary Stoltz, unable to live with knowing she had married her brother and borne 3 deformed children, walked into Conewago Creek with stones sewn into her dress pockets. Her body was found 3 miles downstream. Engelhard listed the cause as accidental drowning. Her husband, Hans, stopped speaking entirely, spending days sitting by the window, staring at nothing. Engelhard's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His lectures became rambling diatribes about racial purity and the necessity of sacrifice for scientific progress. He spoke of expanding the experiment, creating satellite communities across Pennsylvania where his theories could be implemented on a larger scale. He had begun corresponding with like-minded physicians in Ohio and Indiana, sharing his methods and encouraging them to establish their own breeding programs. Charlotte knew she had to act. She contacted Frederick Schaefer, a journalist from the Lancaster Examiner investigating rumors of medical malpractice in rural communities. She arranged to meet him at a tavern 10 miles from Harmonia Springs, carrying a satchel full of copied documents that would expose everything. She never made it. Charlotte's body was found in a ravine 2 days later, her neck broken in what Engelhard declared a tragic fall. The documents she carried were never recovered. But Frederick Schaefer was not easily deterred. Charlotte had managed to mail him preliminary information before her death, enough to convince him something terrible was happening in Harmonia Springs. In early April 1871, a spring brought new life to the Pennsylvania countryside. A woman calling herself Elizabeth Morrison arrived in Lancaster. She was 53, her face weathered by years of factory work, her hands scarred from decades at textile mills. She took a room at the White Swan Inn, the same establishment where Engelhard had stayed 15 years earlier, and began making inquiries about Harmonia Springs. She was methodical, examining property records at the county courthouse, talking to merchants supplying the settlement, even attending medical society meetings where Engelhard's name was mentioned in hushed tones. She learned about the community's isolation, the children with deformities, the families who never left, Charlotte Pennypacker's death. Each piece confirmed what she had suspected for 15 years. Elizabeth Morrison was not her real name. She was Mary Elizabeth Brennan, and she had been searching for her stolen twin since 1841. The story she had been told 30 years ago was that her children had died of cholera while she worked a 16-hour shift at the mill. She had been shown death certificates, had even been taken to small graves in a pauper's cemetery. But a mother's instinct knew better. The bodies had been buried in closed caskets due to contagion. The death certificates had been signed by a Dr. C. Engelhard, a name that meant nothing to her then but had haunted her dreams ever since. For 15 years, she had saved every penny, learned to read and write, studied legal documents, traced Dr. Engelhard's career through medical journals and newspaper articles. She discovered his hereditary optimization theories, his connections to a network of doctors conducting similar experiments. She found records of children purchased from poorhouses, bills of sale referring to human beings as specimens. Finally, through a sympathetic clerk in Philadelphia who remembered the unusual case of twins adopted separately on the same day, she traced her children to Harmonia Springs. On April 15, 1871, Elizabeth arrived at the settlement's gates. She had prepared carefully, creating a false identity as a distant Brennan relative, complete with forged documents about an Ohio inheritance requiring William's signature. Engelhard, suspicious but greedy, allowed her entry under close supervision. The first time she saw William, her heart nearly stopped. He was working in the carpentry shop, his back to her, but she knew him instantly, the shoulder posture, the slight head tilt when concentrating, the hair curling at the nape of his neck, her father's posture, her father's hair. When he turned and she saw his face, she had to grip the doorframe to keep from crying out. Those were her mother's eyes, her own brother's nose. This was her son, her baby boy, now a grown man worn down by unimaginable horror. Engelhard's assistant, a brutish man named Roth, stood beside her throughout the visit. She played her role perfectly, discussing the fictional inheritance, showing fabricated documents, expressing concern for her nephew's welfare. William barely responded, his eyes hollow, his voice monotone. He kept glancing toward a house on the eastern edge where a pregnant woman stood in the doorway, watching them with obvious anxiety. That night, Elizabeth snuck out of the community hall where she had been assigned quarters. She had observed the guards' patterns, noted they grew lazy after midnight, relying more on the settlement's isolation than actual vigilance. She made her way to Sarah's house, her heart pounding with each step. When Sarah opened the door, Elizabeth nearly gasped. It was like looking at herself 30 years ago, the same auburn hair she'd had before factory work turned it grey, the same delicate features, the same head tilt when confused. This was her daughter, her baby girl, heavy with child and bearing the exhausted look of someone who had endured unthinkable suffering. "Please," Elizabeth whispered urgently. "Let me in. I'm not who I claim to be. I have something to tell you about your past, about William's past, about who you really are." Sarah, too tired and broken to resist, stepped aside. In the dim light of a single candle, Elizabeth told her everything, how she had been a young widow, 23, working in a Philadelphia textile mill for pennies a day, how her husband had died in a factory accident, leaving her with infant twins and no way to support them, how a well-dressed doctor came to her tenement, claiming to represent a charitable organization placing orphans with wealthy families. "He said you would have better lives," Elizabeth wept, holding Sarah's hands. "He said you would be educated, cared for, given opportunities one could never provide. I was to get you back when I was financially stable. I signed papers I couldn't read. When I returned 2 weeks later with the first payment I'd saved, you were gone. The office was empty. No one would tell me anything." She pulled out a locket worn for 30 years, opening it to reveal a tiny painting, 2 infants barely a year old, one with darker hair, one lighter, but both with the same distinctive eyes. "I had this made before he took you. It cost me a week's wages, but I needed something to remember you by. Look at the eyes. Do you see? They're William's eyes. They're your eyes. Sarah began to sob, great heaving sobs that brought William running from the workshop where he had been unable to sleep. When he saw their mother, recognition was instant despite the years and hardship separating them, the hand shape, the voice sound, something deep and primal recognizing its source. "My babies," Elizabeth whispered, pulling both into her arms. "My beautiful babies. What has he done to you?" But their reunion was witnessed. Young Daniel, sneaking out to meet Rebecca, saw the three through the window. Not understanding but knowing it was important, he ran to tell the only adult he trusted, old Heinrich Weaver, who had grown increasingly suspicious of Engelhardt's work. Within an hour, word spread through the settlement. Families emerged from houses despite the late hour and strict rules against assembly. They gathered in the common area, voices rising from whispers to shouts. Someone rang the meeting hall bell, its bronze voice echoing across the valley. Engelhard appeared in the medical facility doorway, no longer the confident doctor but a cornered animal. He held a pistol in one hand and what appeared to be a chloroform bottle in the other. Behind him stood his three remaining assistants, all armed. "Return to your homes immediately," he shouted. "This assembly is illegal. You are spreading hereditary contamination through proximity." It was Elizabeth who stepped forward, her voice carrying a mother's authority. "Tell them the truth, Engelhard. Tell them what you've done. Tell them you've been making brothers marry sisters. That you've been breeding human beings like cattle." The crowd's murmur grew to a roar. Someone threw a stone, shattering the medical facility's window. Another voice shouted about the dead children, the hillside graves, the families destroyed by his experiments. Engelhard raised his pistol, pointing it at Elizabeth. "You ignorant woman. You would have condemned your children to poverty and ignorance. I gave them purpose. Their suffering serves the advancement of human knowledge. In 100 years, my work will be vindicated." It was William who acted. As Engelhardt's finger tightened on the trigger, William threw himself forward, knocking his mother aside. The bullet caught him in the shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Sarah screamed and ran to him, pressing her hands against the wound as blood seeped between her fingers. The sight of blood broke something in the crowd. They surged forward as one, overwhelming Engelhardt's assistants. Engelhardt himself retreated into the medical facility, barricading the door. But the settlers had become a mob. They broke through using workshop axes, finding Engelhard in his laboratory surrounded by charts, specimens, and preserved remains of malformed infants in glass jars. What happened next would be debated in court documents for years. Engelhard, cornered and desperate, had apparently prepared for this moment. He had rigged the laboratory with chloroform and ether containers, chemicals that, when combined and ignited, would create a devastating fire. Whether he intended to destroy evidence or take everyone with him remains unknown. The explosion could be heard in Lancaster, 15 miles away. The medical facility erupted in flames shooting 50 feet into the air, consuming not just the building but all Engelhardt's records, specimens, and life's work. Engelhardt himself was found in the ruins, burned beyond recognition, identified only by his melted pocket watch remains. The Harmonia Springs fire burned for 2 days. By the time the Lancaster Fire Brigade arrived, there was nothing to save of the medical facility. But the settlers had acted quickly to preserve evidence. Led by Sarah and Elizabeth, they had broken into Engelhardt's office before the fire spread, rescuing documents, ledgers, and the terrible genealogical charts revealing the experiment's full scope. County authorities arrived on the morning of April 18, 1871, to find a community in ruins, not just physically, though the medical facility was destroyed and several houses had caught fire, but spiritually and emotionally. Survivors sat in family groups, some weeping, others staring silently at nothing. Children with visible deformities clung to parents who now understood the terrible truth of their conditions. The initial investigation was led by Judge Harrison Fulton of the Lancaster County Court. A veteran of such proceedings, he thought himself prepared for anything. But as evidence was presented, the forged documents, purchased children, deliberately arranged incestuous marriages, even he was shaken. His preliminary report to Harrisburg used words like unconscionable, monstrous, and beyond the pale of human decency. William survived his gunshot wound, though his left arm would never fully function again. As he recovered, he and Sarah faced impossible questions: what to do with their marriage, their family, their lives. They were husband and wife, but also brother and sister. They had 3 living children: Thomas, now 12, whose deformities made him an object of stares wherever he went, and 2 younger children with slightly less severe conditions. Sarah had miscarried the baby she was carrying, the trauma of revelations causing the loss. The legal ramifications were complex. Technically, Harmonia Springs marriages were invalid, being between siblings, but dissolving them would bastardize the children, leaving them with even less legal protection. Judge Fulton, in what he later called his most difficult decision, ruled the marriages would stand legally, though couples were free to separate. Most did. The financial web supporting Engelhardt's experiment unraveled. Investigations revealed funding from a shadowy network of wealthy eugenicists, including prominent Philadelphia businessmen and at least 1 state senator. These men believed creating a purified white American bloodline was essential to the nation's future and had been willing to fund experiments on poor German and Irish families they saw as expendable. The scandal threatened Pennsylvania society's highest levels. 3 separate congressional inquiries were launched but mysteriously disbanded before conclusions. Documents disappeared from court archives. Witnesses recanted testimony or vanished. The involved state senator died suddenly of what was officially listed as a heart attack, though his family physician had declared him in perfect health days before. By late 1871, Harmonia Springs was a ghost town. Families had scattered, most changing names and moving to other states where their histories were unknown. The Zimmermans went west to Illinois. The Yoders disappeared into Wisconsin's growing German community. The Weavers were rumored to have gone to Canada. Each family carried the terrible secret of what had been done to them and what they had unknowingly done to their children. Sarah and William, after much agonizing, decided to separate. They could not continue as husband and wife knowing they were siblings, but couldn't entirely sever their connection. William went to Ohio, finding carpentry work under an assumed name. Sarah took the children to Baltimore, where Elizabeth had textile industry contacts. They told people she was a war widow, explaining both the children's father's absence and their deformities, which could be attributed to war hardships. Thomas Brennan died in 1874, just 15. His body, twisted by genetic anomalies from his parents' relationship, simply gave out. He was buried in a Baltimore cemetery under the name Thomas Grabber, his mother's maiden name. His headstone bore only name and dates, no mention of parents or family. Sarah stood at his grave with Elizabeth, both weeping for the grandson and son who never had a chance at normal life. The other children faced similar fates. Most died young, their bodies unable to sustain life with such severe genetic damage. Those surviving into adulthood were often sterile, nature's way of preventing continuation of genetic harm. They lived quiet, hidden lives, many in institutions or cared for by religious orders asking no questions about origins. Daniel and Rebecca, the teenage siblings discovering their relationship in time, were perhaps the luckiest. They were taken in by a Philadelphia Quaker family knowing their story but believing in redemption. They grew up as acknowledged siblings, both eventually marrying others and having healthy children. But they never spoke of Harmonia Springs, and their children never knew the horror their parents had narrowly escaped. Elizabeth Brennan lived until 1878, spending final years caring for Sarah and surviving grandchildren. On her deathbed, she made Sarah promise to document everything, to ensure the Harmonia Springs truth would not be entirely lost. Sarah kept that promise, writing a detailed account placed in a safety deposit box with instructions not to be opened for 50 years. In 1921, when that box was finally opened, the world had changed. Eugenics was no longer a fringe theory but embraced by governments worldwide. Sarah's account was dismissed as a traumatized woman's ravings, the physical evidence long destroyed or disappeared. It would take World War II's horrors and Nazi eugenic programs to make people understand what happened in that small Pennsylvania valley. Today, Harmonia Springs is just a name on old maps, the settlement long reclaimed by forest. Hikers occasionally find remnants, a foundation stone, rusted medical equipment, bones from the hillside cemetery where markers have rotted away. The spring still flows, its mineral-rich water bubbling from limestone bedrock, but no one drinks from it. Local legends speak of strange night cries, misshapen shadows moving through trees, a land curse. The truth, as always, is more terrible than legend. Harmonia Springs was not cursed by supernatural forces, but by human ambition, by the belief science could perfect humanity through controlled breeding, by powerful men's willingness to experiment on the powerless. The children who died there, the families destroyed, the lives ruined, they were sacrifices on the altar of a twisted vision of human perfection. In Washington's National Archives, locked in a section requiring special clearance, sit 3 boxes of Harmonia Springs documents, Sarah's journal, fragments of Engelhardt's notes surviving the fire, court testimonies, photographs. Terrible photographs of children born from forced unions. The boxes are marked * restricted until 2071. National Security. * What makes this story truly horrifying is not that it happened, but that it was not unique. Research has uncovered references to similar experiments in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, all connected to the same eugenicist network funding Engelhard. How many other Harmonia Springs existed? How many other families were destroyed in hereditary optimization's name? How many other Dr. Engelhards practiced terrible science on the desperate and vulnerable? The last known Harmonia Springs survivor died in 1943. She was Margaret Yoder, born Margaret Stoltz, one of few children born there without severe deformities. She had spent her life in a Maryland Catholic convent, never speaking of her origins. But on her deathbed, she told her story to a young nun who wrote it down and hid it in convent archives. That account confirmed Sarah's journal in every particular, adding details making the horror even more complete. According to Margaret, there were more settlements, more experiments, more children born of brothers and sisters never knowing their true relationship. She spoke of correspondence seen as a child, letters from doctors in other states comparing results, discussing failures and successes in breeding human beings like livestock. She remembered Engelhard showing visitors jars containing preserved fetuses, pointing out deformities as if they were scientific treasures rather than dead children. She also revealed some fleeing families were tracked by eugenics network agents. Some were paid to remain silent. Others simply disappeared. The Zimmermans, who went to Illinois, were found dead in their farmhouse in 1873, all poisoned. It was ruled murder-suicide, but Margaret knew better. They had been talking about going to newspapers, about exposing what had been done to them. The full Harmonia Springs truth may never be known. Too many documents destroyed. Too many witnesses silenced. Too many powerful people had too much to lose if experiment extent became public. But what we know is enough. Between 1856 and 1871, at least 40 families were subjected to deliberate genetic experimentation. At least 20 couples tricked into marrying siblings. At least 60 children born with severe genetic deformities as a result. And this was just one settlement, one doctor, one experiment. The last Harmonia Springs evidence surfaced in 1995 when a Lancaster County highway construction crew uncovered a mass grave. 17 children's remains were found, all showing severe genetic abnormality signs. DNA testing confirmed they were all related, all products of incestuous unions. The state quietly reinterred them in an unmarked grave, location known only to a few officials. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a 2003 letter found in a prominent Philadelphia family's estate. Written by Engelhard shortly before death, it spoke of his work as merely the beginning. * The seed has been planted. Others will continue what I have started. The purification of the American bloodline is too important to be stopped by the squeamishness of the ignorant. In time, my methods will be vindicated, my vision realized. Harmonia Springs was not an ending, but a beginning. CE. *. What do you think really happened at Harmonia Springs? Was it an isolated incident of medical madness, or part of something larger we still don't fully understand? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story chilled you to the bone, please share it with someone else appreciating dark historical mysteries. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more suppressed stories from America's past. Remember, the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but human beings with power and twisted vision to perfection. Until next time, this has been *Liturgy of Fear*, reminding you that some secrets are buried for a reason.